All right, folks, welcome back to Broken Most Powerful Radio. Today we are talking about murder and possession and how does that go hand in hand? Well, if you've been listening to the show, you know that I've been talking about a case where I helped a gentleman really get back in tune with life is what it came down to. Here's the interesting part. You know, he was arguing with his brother. We talked about that a little bit. We talked about what was heavy on his heart. And he was just saying that he felt a burden on his heart. He felt something heavy there. He felt something that he couldn't understand why he couldn't move forward in life. And he didn't think right away that it was related to his argument with his brother. But, you know, it's one of those things where little by little, things can take over. If we harbor any kind of hate, regret, anger, we want to be right, and we can't just let it go. Well, these things can happen. So when we talked about this, and I said, I think this burden with your brother is a big issue. I think this argument with your brother is a big issue. And initially he was kind of like, it's just not that big a deal. I mean, I know that we're arguing, but it's not that big a deal. And I said, well, you know, we've tried medication. We've tried a lot of really good medication and nothing seems to touch it. There's nothing physically wrong with you, but why don't you just try this? And this is probably the hardest part of them all. I think you need to figure out a way to how to forgive your brother. I wasn't too happy about that at first, and not in the sense that he was angry at me. It was kind of more along these lines where he said, yeah, you know, I think I know that eventually I'm going to have to cross that road, but I don't know that I'm ready to do that. And I said, well, you know, it's just something to consider. I said, we can keep trying medication. Nothing seems to have touched you thus far. We can keep trying it. No big deal. But he wasn't sure that that's the way he wanted to go until I said, well, you know, that's up to you. That's your option. You know, there's not much I can offer you other than medication and counseling. But really, as human beings, this is where something's burdening us. If there's something wrong with my leg or there's something wrong, let's say I get injured, nobody else can do the physical therapy for me. Somebody can be there to help me out. I can have cheerleaders telling me, hey, let's get you some physical therapy and, you know, we're going to stand here. But nobody can do the stretches for me. I've got to do those stretches. I got to lift the weights. I've got to do the exercises to get my muscles stronger or whatever it is my body needs at the time. And unless I do the heavy lifting or the movement or the stretching or whatnot, the muscle, the area that's traumatized, the area that needs therapy or something is going to stay that way. There's not going to be any change. And so for him, he decided, okay, I'm going to try this out. I'm going to do it. And he wanted my advice on how to do it. And I said, well, you know, I don't know that I can give you advice because I'm not part of the argument. But the only thing I would say is the best advice I can give you, because sometimes when people want advice, they want answers. And I said, I don't know that I have answers. You know, the best advice I can give you is, number one, do an examination of conscience. Sit there and just kind of look at what do you feel is not going on right spiritually. Obviously, we've been talking about your brother and we want to see what's going on with him. But what do you feel is not going on spiritually in your life besides that? Is there anything else that needs improvement? Is there anything else that needs worked on? Is there anything else that's keeping you from having a good relationship with God? And he said, well, you know, he couldn't tell at first. He said he'd try it out. And, you know, he was Christian. So he said he'd try out, you know, just reviewing the 10 Commandments, reading the Bible a little bit, seeing what God would put in his heart and what would speak to him as far as these are the things that are troublesome in my life. And so he started doing that. And when he did, he said, okay, I think I know what I need to do. And I said, okay, well, what do you think you're going to do? And he said, I think the first thing I need to do is go apologize to my wife and my kids. And I said, well, what are you talking about? So I thought that, you know, it kind of surprised me a little bit. I didn't want to say anything, but, you know, just wanted to get his opinion as to why this was. I thought initially, oh, he's avoiding having to talk to his brother, you know, because that's really where the crux of it is. And he said, no, I think I need to start there for a couple of reasons. He said, you know, because I've been holding on to this anger, I've been holding on to this frustration, to this argument with my brother. He said, I feel like I've kind of been neglecting my kids or my wife, and not in a way that they would necessarily recognize, but they don't get the best of me. I didn't realize that I was putting a lot of energy into not feeling this anger, into harboring this anger, into all the complexities of this anger, you know, trying to ignore it during the day, trying to make it not a big deal, trying to avoid talking to my brother. And he said, that's taken up a lot of energy that I didn't realize. And I haven't been there for my family the way I should or the way I'm supposed to. So I said, wow, that's pretty insightful. He said, I think I need to do that first, and then that'll help me practice talking to my brother. I said, okay. And so he went ahead and did that. And he said that his wife at first didn't, his kids really didn't get it. And they were just like, oh, we don't know what you're talking about, but okay. His kids were younger. And then he spoke to his wife and she said, oh, and he said, I was glad that I spoke to her because actually she helped me out to see a few things that I wasn't recognizing that about myself. And she also helped me out with how to approach my brother and how to talk to my brother, and so eventually he did talk to his brother, came back. He said, life wasn't perfect necessarily because nobody's life is, but he did feel as he was talking to his brother, the release from his heart of anything angry, of any anger, of anything burdensome, of this sense that he couldn't move forward. He said, things are easier now is the way he described it. He said there was a release, like the door was open and things are easier is what he said, kind of like something like the floodgates were open, like you open a door and all the crud from the closet comes out and falls on the floor or something along those lines. There's now open space. There's an emptiness there, a happy emptiness of all this bad stuff that just came out. And he said that it was important and it made him realize a few things. He liked the reading after that. He said this reading from Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26, because he said that he could understand now, not so much, he said, it kind of creeps up on you. He said, I didn't realize that what was happening to me inside as I was holding on to this burden of this murder, if you will, the way Christ describes it, not the way the world describes it, not the way the serpent described death in the book of Genesis, but a really spiritual death, a very real murder, a very real death in terms of what's going on spiritually and in our hearts. But the part he said that really spoke to him, and that was the part that that he and I went over, was this part about being handed over to the guard who will throw you into prison. And he said at first, whenever he read that, he thought, well, gosh, why would you just hand somebody over to the guard? And he said what he didn't realize was, the judge didn't have a choice. He said, because I wasn't giving God a choice but to hand me over to the guard and to be in a prison. And he said, but now I feel released. I feel released because I apologize not just to my brother, but to my family as well. And it really made me think about a few things. When there's this kind of death, it affects so many people that we don't even realize. We think that, us having an argument or holding something against somebody else is just between us and that, that's my burden to carry, their burden to carry, or, until we figure it out, well, my life goes on. But this really brought to light for me the reality of the communion of saints and how we are truly connected. He felt like he wasn't present to his family because he's holding on to this argument between himself and his brother. And now he's at the point where, he's saying, gosh, I recognize now that this is affecting other people as well. It's like a death. When we go to a funeral, it's not just like I go to somebody's funeral and I realize that it was just that person affecting my life and I'm really sad that they've passed away. But I realize whenever there's a funeral, there's a lot of people who get touched by each one of us that we might not even recognize. I mean, we might not even realize. And if people are affected that way by each of us, they're going to be affected in positive and negative ways. If there is a death, that death is not just going to affect my relationship with that person, but it's going to affect their relationship with everybody else. If there's a death the way this is, if there's an argument, if there's a frustration, if there's an anger, we're going to be carrying heavy burdens that, we think that we're holding a grudge against somebody else and we're not going to forgive them. We're not going to let it go because I'm in the right, and little do I know that I'm carrying that. But as I carry it, I'm going to carry that with me, even as I'm interacting with other people. I'm not going to give other people the best of me. And that can be really challenging. In life, it can be really challenging for relationships. It can be really challenging in our wondering why we're not doing the best in our lives. Now, in this man's particular relationship with his brother, it came down to they just needed to hash things out. Some things he said that they agreed to disagree on. But the fact that there was an open communication, that they were at peace, that they weren't going to push each other's buttons, that they were actually listening to each other and listening to, man, this is really important. This really hurt you. And I'm sorry about that. That was the key, he said. He said it wasn't about me anymore. It was about, I could see where he was in pain. I could see where he was also hurting. And he said, I didn't even realize that. I thought he didn't care. I thought that he was just angry and didn't care. And the whole time, I cared, but I didn't want to broach anything because I didn't want to get into that argument. He said there was something very beautiful about them being able to sit down and talk. He said, unfortunately, there is a little bit of a rift still in the sense that even though they've patched things up and things were together, he said, it's going to take a little bit of time for healing to take place because it's not like I can see him and pretend that all this time didn't happen. And that's where they were at. I've heard of other relationships where, they make up and it's like nothing happened. It's like we're going to put all this behind us and we're going to start all over. He said the hard part was the trust. The hard part now is trusting that they're going to be able to talk and not fall into the same trap, not, trusting each other to respect each other. And I thought that was interesting too, because if we notice in the fall of man, one of the things that changed when Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the tree, and all of a sudden, what happened to them? They ate it. It says, then the eyes of both of them were open, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. If you listen to theologians on this, when this happens after this rift, they've both sinned. There's been a rift here. He's blaming her. She's blaming the serpent. They're no longer in harmony. Why did they have to sew these fig leaves together and cover themselves? Because there was a lack of trust. Because now they could not trust each other. They couldn't trust that you're going to see me as I am and you're going to respect my dignity, and vice versa. They didn't feel that for each other. Now there's a vulnerability they don't want to share, because I can't trust that you are going to see me with dignity. And that's kind of what happens with relationships. That's what happens with us when we have these long rifts. Unless we can come to a full place where we say, hey, you know what? I'm going to let all this go and I'm just going to be vulnerable. That's a very, very big challenge. When the communion of saints, when we get to heaven, it's going to be, they always talk about heaven being a great marriage between us and Christ. And it's going to be 100% vulnerability. There's not going to be a need for clothing, if you will, because we're going to be totally visible to each other, but in the light of Christ. When there's this argument, when there's a death, just like for Adam and Eve, they died spiritually. If I kill somebody spiritually in my life, all of a sudden, there needs to be covering up. There needs to be distance. So what can we say, folks? What can we say about this? Was this man truly possessed? Yeah, in a way. We allow ourselves to be possessed by different things. Not the Hollywood possession. The Hollywood possession, what you see in shows and things like that, that's pretty extreme. And I think that the reality is that's the possession hell wants us to see. But the more important possession are the little ones that we allow ourselves to fall into every day, when we decide, you know what, I think I know better. I think I'm going to hold on to this anger. I think I'm not going to forgive somebody, because why would I let them have that? And we don't realize that we're really hurting ourselves. We're burdening ourselves. Once we get to the point where we say, hey, you know what, I'm going to examine my conscience. I'm going to see where I'm at. It doesn't matter what anybody else is doing. I'm going to put myself in a place where I want to be good with God. And if I'm holding something against my brother, well, I do not want to be in this prison. I do not want my heart to be in this prison. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cleanse myself, and I'm going to get out there and I'm going to apologize, and I'm going to make things right, even if they don't want to make it right with me. But I'm going to unburden myself so that I can be free, so that I can move forward, and that I can say, hey, I'm ready to make it into heaven. I'm not going to allow anything evil into my heart or be possessed in any way because of my own fault and because of my own sins. And that is really the true freedom for us in the light of Christ and the light of heaven. Until next week, this is Dr. Sandoval saying, keep it Catholic.